All right, here is part 5 of the series pertaining to the New World Order. All right, and if you haven't caught parts 1 through 4, you might want to check those out. I'm not, since this is audio predominantly, I'm not really putting many of the documented proofs that I discuss in this series. I'm not putting them up for you. You can reach me by my email at KnowledgeWell4U at gmail.com. KnowledgeWell for, I forget if it's KnowledgeWell Media for you. Anyways, try to look in the description, and I'll try to remember to put the email there. I think it's KnowledgeWell4U at gmail.com. So if you'd like the documented proofs and things and that I am discussing here, I'd be happy to provide those to you. Otherwise, just look for KnowledgeWell Media on YouTube, and you can get in contact with me through the comment section or something like that. We'll leave it at that. But anyways, on to part 5 here, and talking about the New World Order, and as a topic, the merchant class. Okay, so the merchant class. So my studies have taken me as far back as the 1200 to late 1300 centuries, where there were 2 types of securities. Okay, and one being the merchant statute merchant, and the other one being the merchant staple. Okay, there was the staple, S-T-A-P-L-E, was the mart, where you sold your goods, where the merchants would set up a stand, a table, and you could come and bring some collateral, and then you could get things on credit that you needed, backed by your collateral, or you could purchase. But beware, because if you did not pay back that debt, then they would keep the collateral, and sometimes they would keep you, all right, till you paid that debt off. So that's what the merchant staple was. It was like the marketplace that was, let's see, how do you put it? That was backed by the king, backed by royalty, backed by the noble class, and they had the monopoly because no one else could sell here. It was exclusively for a particular merchant class. Okay, but this is where people came to get what they needed, the textiles and things that they needed, raw materials, as well as resale items. Okay, and so those were the types of securities. The other one being the statute merchant. I'll get into that a little bit later. Got to do some more research, but those are your 2 types of securities, and this is what gave the merchant class the monopoly. Okay, so this was back in the 1200s, 1300 centuries, and this is kind of your introduction, I believe, of the merchant class and them coming to power, and you know how they would participate in unjust enrichments and tipping scales, and kind of the money changers that we talked about in part 4 that the Yeshua ousted from the temple when he whipped them out. Okay, so pay attention to part 4, and so I won't have to deliberate much on that point. But this is where they came from, and so this is what we've been dealing with through time, and they've graduated and evolved to this upper echelon nobility class, titles of nobility, Obviously, getting into the 1600s, 1700s, you have Great Britain being very much in power over the colonies, leading to the Revolutionary War, where the people had had enough of Great Britain's taxation, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and the likes, and it led to the Revolutionary War, where the people, the colonies, had had enough, okay, and had enough of the mercantilism of the king of Great Britain, the nobility class, the merchants, cheating them and subjecting them to unfair practices in merchandising, trade, and commerce. Okay, so this is your merchant class. This is where they came from, and they only got worse as time has gone on, and they've eventually, you'll see, morphed into something much more significant, much more hidden, actually. And they've kind of taken on a different role, just as I stated early on, how the Roman Empire has morphed into not so much a kingship, but more of a religious royalty. The Vatican, the Pope, still wears a crown, still goes about the world. People bow to him, they kiss his ring. He still is royalty, but he took on a different role. The Vatican, the Pope, the Church took on a different role so that they would come off less offensive, because at one time, actually throughout history, you'll find that countries actually wanted nothing to do with the Catholic Pope, and even threatening to throw him off a cliff at one point. And so we can't forget that they were on the king's payroll. All right, are we there? All right. So as I was stating, we can't forget that this nobility class, this merchant class, was on the payroll of the king. Okay, and as I also stated, I think in part 3, it doesn't really matter whether or not the king knew that this merchant class was participating in this usury or unfair and unjust enrichment of the subjects, because the king only paid attention to what was coming in, and as far as finances and taxes. And so whether or not he knew what this merchant class was participating in order to make that happen is a moot point. What does matter is that it did take place, it did happen, and the effect that it had on the colonies of yesterday, and the biblical historical record, and the effect that it had there. And so, in the effect that it's actually having today, which is the same thing, which is, I contend, that emergence of that new world order. Okay, so, in the 1700s, you had this same merchant class that was selling arms and products. They were trading and merchandising in products. The colonies grew the raw material, and then they would sell it to the merchants. The merchants would give them money for the products, and then ship that product to Great Britain. Great Britain would then create items with the raw materials, and then turn around and resell those items back to the colonies at perhaps 10 times the value, okay, for the finished product. That was who the merchant class was. Okay, at the same time, they were also selling and trading merchandising with the French and other nations around the world. Okay, no doubt, charging exorbitant amounts of money for items, because they could set the price. Okay, including their shipping fees and all that kind of thing. They were the ones that could set the price, and as long as they were bringing the cut back to the king, they were enriched. And more times than not, more than likely, they were unjustly enriched. Okay? And so this is the paradigm. This is what was going on. This is the power that the merchant class had. If you can imagine, with them being the ones that perhaps set the pricing of these items and charging for shipping fees, they being the ones with the monopoly on the shipping and cargo and the travel, the mileage and all that kind of thing, they being the ones that set those costs and prices, and then on top of that, the king setting taxes on certain imports and things like that, trade wars, you can imagine how much money was being exchanged in commerce between nations in Great Britain and the merchant class. Okay, so that without the merchant class, even Great Britain would be in kind of bad sorts, because the king isn't going to get on the ship necessarily and peddle wares and sell to other nations and make trade agreements and things like that. So it took a special conniving, thrifty, smart, subtle class of people to participate in this industry of the merchant class. You can imagine. And they participated in not only commercial trade, but they also participated in collecting of the taxes for the king. Also, there is record that the merchant would sell to people like the French, and then turn around and rob them, kind of as a mercenary, which mercenary obviously comes from mercantile, which obviously is where we get merchant from. So that class were mercenaries as well. So they were probably trained in the art of the skill of battle and war as well, because if you look up who the privateers were, that's a special class of merchant, where they would actually do things similar to what a pirate would do, and sell to on both sides of the war to both parties, and then turn around and under the charter of the king, turn around and rob who they just sold the items to. Okay, so they weren't necessarily a honorable people, as I stated before. They did diabolical things in the name of the king, and you don't dare go against these class of merchants as titles of nobility under the kingship, because if you did anything against the king's men, you'd have to deal with the king. Okay, and then you'd be facing war and imprisonment and perhaps death for interfering and obstructing the king's men from carrying out the charter of the king. And so these are that merchant class. And hopefully you're starting to see the evolution and up until today. And we will inevitably peek behind the curtain to see who these merchant men and perhaps women are today in our time. And that's where we're headed. So stay tuned. This one was a little bit shorter than the other ones by maybe 30 seconds. This is part 5 of the New World Order series, and the sub-classification of the merchants. All right? Probably should call it Kingsmen. No wonder the movie there's a new movie. This is 2019, actually, that I'm doing these recordings, this series. And there's a new movie actually coming out called Kingsmen. I think there's been several within the series. And so I implore you should probably check those out, because a lot of times they're telling us things in movies, and they're actually disclosing historical records. All right? So, again, thanks for tuning in. This is part 5. Stay tuned for part 6. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comment section below. And again, if you're looking for the historical record in document form or something to that effect, just get a hold to me. Go ahead and put something in the comment section. If you enjoy this series and you think that someone else should hear them, then please feel free to share them and like and subscribe, and we'll keep them going. All right. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you on part 6.